If everyone's here, I can just do a little welcome for our guests. We're joined today by Holly Zanville. Holly is actually my colleague at George Washington University. She co-directs a program on skills, credentials, and workforce policy, and has been involved in the learn and work ecosystem for many, many years. Has been worked with Lumina Foundation and before coming to GW. I've been involved in a number of projects, including the Learn and Work Ecosystem Library we'll hear about today, and connecting credentials that we will also be talking about as we do a little bit of a retrospective, looking back on the impact of past projects that really had an impact on our field. We're also joined by Wendy Sedlak from the Lumina Foundation. Wendy has been a program officer involved in funding and supporting many important initiatives, and has been a huge supporter of the work of many projects, including our non-degree credentials research network. So we're very thankful that both of them were able to take the time to join us today. Um, so this we have this title, "The Power of Begetting." I thought it was a pretty fun title. This idea that that the work that we do today can plant seeds for the future. This idea that we're going to talk about how we can build upon the legacy of past projects in our work and how we can ensure the preservation of our work for the future. So I'll go ahead, and I think, Holly, you were planning to go first, right?
Yes, I am. Thanks so much, Kyle.
Yeah, go for it, Holly. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. We're so pleased to join the NCRN today for what we hope will be primarily a conversation about how the work that we do can sometimes continue to influence the field long after funding ends, and what we can do to aim for what we're calling the power of beginning. We shared in advance, if you'd go to the next slide, we shared in advance a draft discussion paper on this that we hope you've had a chance to look through. We plan to finalize the paper after today's discussion, so our thinking actually could be impacted by your thoughts. So feel free to add reactions to anything we say today into the chat, or things you may have thought about when you were reading the paper. We're going to start out by giving you two examples of begetting. Then we're going to share some latest updates on the Learn and Work Ecosystem Library, then move to kind of an organic conversation between Wendy and me around the kind of questions that you see in this peach-colored box in the center of this slide. Then we're going to open it up, and we'd like to hear from you all. What do you think about these issues and how they're impacting your work? So next slide. Let's start with begetting. There are other words for this other than begetting, but I've come to kind of like this term begetting for the phenomenon where the influence of an initiative continues long after the initiative ends through its ideas, through its tools, networks, and conceptual frameworks, often in ways, and actually generally not in ways that are planned or foreseen. So here's our first example for you to consider. October marked the 10th anniversary of Connecting Credentials. Between 2016 and 2018, the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce, also known as CSW, led the Connecting Credentials campaign to improve connectivity, transparency, and equity in credentialing. This website, you're seeing it here, it's what it looked like, it still looks like. This website was developed to support the campaign. Among its many pieces of content, it assembled resources in 5 key areas: learning mobility, common language, employer leadership, data and technology, and trust and quality assurance. And you can know that these terms have not gone away. They're still current issues that we're all grappling with. Well, the campaign did develop a 7-point action plan that identified 25 different actions that could be undertaken to address problems in the 5 areas that I just mentioned, and more than 100 ways those actions could be accomplished. Especially notable was the development of something called the Connecting Credentials Framework, which describes 8 levels of achievement based on the complexity and the scope of knowledge, skills, and abilities demonstrated by learners. Those familiar with qualification frameworks in other nations recognized then, and still when you look at it, that its structure of level gradations for credentials really drew on internationally recognized practices, which the US project was trying to tailor for a US context, particularly placing attention on sub-associate degree credentials, because that's where so many of the emerging credentials we're actually focusing then, and actually still now, on short-term credentials, badges, and micro-credentials. The NCRN was actually born in that context too, as funders were starting to pay attention to the rapidly changing credentialing marketplace. So 5 group reports were completed. A glossary of key credentialing definitions came to be housed at this credentialing website. And the members of the work groups, we listed at the end of the discussion draft that we sent in it to you all to honor their work on the occasion of this anniversary, and so that you could identify many of them as beginners who went on to influence things like the work of the T3 Innovation Network, CBAN, Credential Engine, so many other efforts, and yes, put NCRN on the list. So, and some of you, I think, who are attending today were actually on that list. So I hope you see your name and you know that you have contributed a tremendous amount to a lot of early work that has really gone on to impact a lot of additional work. Then the Connecting Credentials website was actually last updated in 2018 when its grant funding ended. The website now resides at the Learn and Work Ecosystem Library Archive in order to preserve its resources. I'll come back to the archive concept later because this is really important. So next slide, I'm going to move to our second example. So this is the Funders Mapping Project. It's known by different names, but I think the foundations were calling it something like this, the Funders Mapping Project. And it developed after there was a request by 30 national foundations that had actually gotten together to meet to see if we could map key investments across the Learn and Work ecosystem and identify goals for a more connected ecosystem. Everyone really had that in common. So there was a first map that was developed, and it included 17 pretty large-scale projects. That later expanded the following year to 22 because of a growing number of investments being made by the foundations. And finally, it expanded to 36 in that last year that the guide was updated in 2020. Initiatives in the guide is still housed at the Lumina Foundation website, contain descriptions. It's hard to see. I know these are those little things with bullets. Those are all different initiatives. These are descriptions of key initiatives, grant funded projects by stage of progress, timeline, and relationship to other work. And what's interesting, I'm going to mention the categories because again, think about these in relationship to topics you're hearing about today. But the initiatives were categorized into 6 areas that the funders identified as of really high interest to them. Build credential transparency infrastructure, accelerate ecosystem developments through alignments and alliances, create and implement technology data standards to drive and connect systems, advance understanding of credentials of value, advance navigation tools, verifications and quality assurance, and expand messaging around credential transparency. So those were the topics that the funders were really interested in, and that's what they asked us to build that first map around. This site was actually last updated in January 2020 when the internally funded project closed, and most folks didn't even know about this project. But honestly, it didn't really close because it would serendipitously become begotten behind an initiative called the Learn and Work Ecosystem Library, which I'm going to discuss briefly for those of you who don't know about the library or who don't know about some of our most recent features. So next slide, if you come to our main page, which looks like this, you're going to see that the Learn and Work Ecosystem Library is a dynamic digital resource collection that offers curated, wait, get my notes screwed up and I don't want to get this wrong. Curated content such as ecosystem component overviews, glossary terms, topic briefs, descriptions of initiatives, organizational profiles, and special research reports. So when you come to the library, you can select any of 12 languages to read our content. And our recent trends report, and some of you have actually seen that, contains lots of interesting analytics about the library and our growth, but it also tells us that our content has been read in 10 different languages so far. So we have an international audience who's interested in what's happening in the Learn and Work ecosystem, mostly in the US, although we have international content. Well, we organize, please go to the next slide. We organize our collection around 12 key components of the Learn and Work ecosystem, like credentials and providers, policy, data and data systems, verification and record keeping, employers and workforce, and quality and value. And these numbers, sorry, go back. You see the index there at 1862, that number literally changes daily because we're adding content continuously. So we wanted you to get a sense of the range of resources that are there and the kind of numbers. And I already mentioned the archive, and I'll mention some of that a little bit later. So the next slide. The 12 key components that I've been mentioning of the ecosystem are highlighted on what we call our wheel graphic, which is, if you just go back, yeah. which you can find on our main page if you just scroll down it. And it's really not enough for any of us to work on improving the ecosystem if we just focus in one or two or three areas, like career navigation or like verification record keeping. Really, to have a healthy ecosystem, all the areas of the ecosystem have to be connected and coordinated. So to show you an example of what a typical content piece looks like, the next slide shows you an entry from our initiative section. So I pulled the one for the NCRN. So you could see the type of tagging that we do. All of our pieces will look like this, and that we provide an external link to the organization and relevant resources. And if you want a citation to put into a document, it'll give you the type of the model of types of citation you may want. So that's an example of a content piece. So the next one, next slide. On the what's new front, wanted to point out to you, because not everyone knows this quite yet, that the library is becoming more than a reference resource. We're now able to offer some organizations, but mostly coalitions of organizations, the opportunity to create a national neutral hub for sharing resources that support innovation across the ecosystem. So I think of this as like a room at the digital inn or a digital B&B. And if you go to the special projects page, this page, you'll see that there are 11 projects working with the library to help get their information out there now. But in January, you'll see 7 major new ones that are coming. I can't share them with you for confidentiality reasons today, but we're really excited about these. So check back in a few weeks or find information about this at our LinkedIn page. So I'm going to stop here. There's 2 slides to follow, but that's more for people that want the slide deck later on. So if we just take the slides down, that would be great. So I've given you the 2 beginning examples and a quick overview of the library. And if you have any questions about the library, feel free to put them in the chat. We can always go back and answer some specifics. So now Wendy and I are going to talk about these ideas in a somewhat organic conversation. We haven't really practiced this. So Wendy, I'm going to have you start out.
Perfect. I'm going to kick it over to you and keep you in the limelight. So first, I just want to say thank you to everyone. I know it's a really busy time of year and folks are working on all their end of year deliverables. So thanks so much for folks carving out a little time to spend with us and joining in this conversation. So Holly, I'm going to keep you in the spotlight because you were there for all of this work. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more from you about what did you see or experience during connecting credentials that signaled it might have a long tail to the work? And then subsequently, I'm curious about sort of what surprised you about the work ultimately, about what the work ultimately beget.
I don't know I could ever get Wendy to talk about begetting. It's a great concept. So honestly, I didn't start thinking about this at the time when I was at Lumina and we were funding a lot of this work and particularly connecting credentials. I didn't think about begetting back then. It was not a concept in my head even. It was just, let's fund a project. It'll probably go on. Hopefully it'll go on longer and longer if its outcomes are meaningful. But in retrospect, there were many things that happened that suggested that it might have a long tail to continue in some form or another. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about looking back through the rearview mirror now is that there was very high interest in the effort. Many folks were agreeing to participate on work groups. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes you ask your friends and could you participate in this or that, but they don't always come to the meetings. People were coming to the meetings. They were very engaged. They were taking on leadership roles, which meant they had to do a lot of the writing. That was a little unusual. And that, I think, in retrospect, meant that the vision was really important and that it was probably going to have a long tail, to use that way of thinking about it. There seemed to be a recognition, maybe an energy, that we were all into something really important. It was a very solid vision, and it was playing its way out among lots of different folks. And it just felt like there was a lot of energy in the room. So those were the things that signaled it might have a long tail. And furthermore, the U.S. credentialing marketplace was changing rapidly. But it wasn't going to change in a year. Everyone could read the tea leaves and see this was going to go on for a while, because things like that just don't get done all that quickly. So, but what surprised me with your second question, Wendy, was I kind of came up with 2 surprises. One was it surprised me that organizations we didn't know were coming to the project after it closed down, asking to join the organizational list. So that meant to me that the original vision was really important, and that little surprised me because I thought as soon as people thought, oh, the funding's done, something's happening there, we're sort of done with that. That's not what happened, and we had journalists calling us asking for more information and outcomes. So that meant that something was continuing conceptually with it. The other thing that surprised me was that even though the grant for Connecting Credentials stopped officially in 2018, we were actually noticing a tremendous amount of swirling around some of the same topics. And I mentioned the topics so you could keep in mind because they're still swirling. They may have changed the names a little. Credentials of value is very uppermost, but it was on the list back then too. We were all concerned about that. So we were noticing that these topics were swirling and they were coming up in other venues. And the one was at the T3 network at the US Chamber, which was developing at the same time a pretty large network, pulling on actually some of the same folks that were in the Connecting Credentials network. But they were gaining a footing and receiving grants, and several folks in that work played an important role in Connecting Credentials. But I would say the work was focusing more in the Chamber's natural swim lane, which was really more on employer and data related topics, emerging discussions around learning and employment records. But it wasn't the wheel. It wasn't the full ecosystem. It was a portion of the ecosystem, but a very important portion. So the Chamber had picked off a portion, and they were actually, in my mind, uh, riffing almost on some of what had already been developed because some of them were ones who had developed the actual reports. The second one was CBEN. It was very small at the time. It was picking up speed, and several ideas around competency-based approaches were part of the Connecting Credentials discussion. Credential Engine and transparency issues were moving forward, spawned, or you could say begotten, from the Credential Transparency Initiative, which was a research feasibility effort around credential transparency that was led then by Steve Crawford, by Bob Sheets, Roy Swift, and several others who were very active in connecting credentials. So that's a lot of beginning. And then there was another very interesting begotten that came from the credentials framework by community colleges who had really not been as an important part of a lot of the credentialing conversations, although you would think intuitively they would be, they were not. And leadership was coming from AACC because of growing awareness of the importance of sub-associate degree credentialing and growing awareness of both credit and non-credit pathways. So AACC created a project called the Right Signals National Initiative, and they basically were trying out in various community colleges that Connecting Credentials framework. And Jen Worth at AACC, who was an important leader in the Connecting Credentials work, helped to take some of those ideas forward. So in a way, it shouldn't have been a surprise, but it was to see tremendous swirling. And at the time, I think some of us were thinking, why don't we just stay with Connecting Credentials? But in fact, I now have a new respect for what happens with begetting. And then sometimes it's probably good to move to 5 other organizations or 10 other organizations. That's another way of thinking about it that some of us just didn't think about. I'll just own it myself. I didn't think about growth in that way. And Wendy, you may want to comment on that in the middle of all the swirling is right around the time you joined Lumina.
It was. So it was I'll say it was just an important grounding for my time at Lumina. As you said, this work sort of seeded all of this other work, which is sort of my introduction to what this world looked like. And I appreciate that you mentioned community colleges, and I would say similarly, sort of the focus on non-degree credentials really over the last few years, I would say is connected to this as well. The piece that you mentioned around around credential engine. I think, a big part of this work was around the widespread adoption of sort of shared language and frameworks for learning and skills. And so in terms of some of those fingerprints that you see, I would say definitely with Credential Engine, the credential transparency movement, especially CTDL, and the growth that you've seen with Credential Engine itself. I would say some of the state level skills frameworks that have come out of this in places like Indiana and Colorado that sort of mirror connecting credentials, emphasis on competencies and portability. That's been a big thing. Some of the pieces around sort of employer-led hiring initiatives that now sort of articulate roles and responsibilities in terms of sort of demonstrated skills rather than seat time. That's been a big thing. So those are some of the other pieces that I would bring to bear specific to sort of connecting credentials. And then sort of in terms of the funder mapping initiative, again, that's work that you led, Holly, and really had the foresight to start thinking about and the importance of sort of mapping everything that was happening in this space, right? And so I'll say what was so important about that, especially as somebody relatively, definitely new to philanthropy and new to sort of the specifics of the ecosystem of higher ed, is that really helped showcase a new level of sort of visibility of sort of who funds what and who all the different players are within that ecosystem across sort of the credentialing landscape, and where there are gaps and where overlaps exist. So I think that those sort of insights help to kind of normalize ecosystem thinking that we see everywhere now, right? So you're seeing a lot more in terms of learn and work ecosystems. I'll say you talked about value and credentials of value, which is obviously something that we are thinking about and talking about a lot at Lumina. And I think, in terms of that sort of funder mapping, we're seeing more and more sort of regions building learn and work ecosystems and really paying attention much more explicitly about all the different sort of players in the space, right? You've got K-12, you've got higher ed, you've got your workforce agencies, employers, community organizations, not to mention students who sit at the center of all of this. And so I think that, that initial work around sort of mapping the landscape itself has really helped to sort of unearth the players, the ecosystem itself, and has really been sort of spun sort of the growth in terms of some of the national coalitions that are starting to build now.
And I have noticed, and I don't know if you think this is true, Annie, but it seems to me that there are more funders collaboratives that have been spawned in the last, I don't know, 5, 8 years, where the funders are getting together, leveraging their monies, presumably having meetings to talk about these very issues, knowing that one funder can't do it all, and that there's maybe more power in coming together. So from the time when I started in 2006 with Lumina, having come from 20 years in a state system office, I don't, there was a first meeting with the Gates Foundation. It was the first, we were all new then, but it was the first time we had met. I think there are many more funders collaborators now, but
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
wondering, you're in the thick of it. So is that right? That there's more of that going on?
From my, from my vantage point, yes, right. So I've been at Lumina 7 years now. There's a lot of funder collaboratives, and I would say that's becoming even more and more important in the current federal landscape in which we are living, right? Where we know that philanthropy is, I've said it over and over again, is not going to fill the void of federal funding, but it has become more and more important for all of us to kind of work together collectively to be able to make the progress we want to see in this domain. I wanted to ask you, flipping it back to you, Holly, how would you say the conversation around credential transparency and value has sort of evolved over time?
Well, since I try to read every morning for the library purposes, I'm seeing much more attention to credentials of value cropping up. So I know that that's more ever present in the different trade presses, et cetera. So although it was present back then when connecting credentials kicked off, it's more present now. And so with the wide array of credentials having grown so much, and you probably all saw the Credential Engine 2025 report that just came out this week, depicting the growth of what we used to call alternative credentials. The areas of growth are what we used to call alternative. I'm glad we're not really calling it that anymore. So but with that is coming just this morning, a couple pushbacks on LinkedIn about, well, yeah, there's a lot more of it, but that doesn't mean they're all credentials of value. What are we going to do? And I know Michelle Van Noy has been working especially on credentials of value the last several years and developing frameworks around that. So we know that that's really important. It's evolved. I don't know if there's great answers yet about value, because it's the value to students, yes, It's also the value to policymakers who are having to invest in these programs. Yes, it's value to employers who maybe they want people that have short-term credentials and they can bring them into their upskilling and training scenarios, which may not even be connected to higher ed. So I personally think that it's really complicated, the credentials of value conversation. And I worry that it's going to become too simplistic that look at a wage and then maybe it's about the learner's wage, but is it enough thought through? So I think it's an important issue, and I suspect I can't see right now who's in the participants in the webinar, but I'm guessing that many of the folks here are actually working on credentials of value efforts and could better speak to this question then. So it'd be great to see some of you put stuff in the chat if that's something that you want to talk about. So I think that's what I would say about credentials of value. More important, lots of folks in it. I think it's really complicated and there's not going to be a simple answer,
Yeah,
particularly if we don't
yeah.
have good data. We can't even look at wage data and people are losing their jobs. So maybe they just keep a job that's going to become a credential of value in 3 years from now. Maybe it's not about the wage. Could I just keep my job with AI taking away jobs? So like, I don't know what the new algorithms are going to be. So that'll be my quick response.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I will say, at Lumina, a lot of us are looking at this idea of credentials of value from different vantage points. I'll say within my portfolio, we are thinking about it holistically, right? So to your point, all of those different audiences, policymakers, employers, students, families, communities, institutions, how are folks thinking about value and what a credential of value means? And more broadly, what is value in terms of higher education? Because I think it is beyond sort of just the economic returns, as we know. So it's not it's a multifaceted way of thinking about it, and I think it's important for us to be cognizant of that. I do think the data is sort of the starting point. So what do we have that we can actually look to be able to sort of assess what value means and looks like. I will say, we have seen value around, there's more around sort of quality, transparency, mobility, equity, not simply ROI. We're seeing that a little bit with sort of the Carnegie classifications, right? You've got economic and social mobility in there. Obviously, at Lumen and Gallup, we've got sort of those value frameworks and sort of more sophisticated conversations about sort of credentials that pay off within equity contexts. And I'll say, it was just a couple of years ago that internally we talked about equity and quality as sort of separate entities. But now we folded equity into quality, right? You can't have something that is quality without considering equity. So that's another place of growth and sort of change, even in the short time that I've been here. I'm going to turn it over to you again, Holly. Also, I love that your name says Holly Holly. I don't know if you've noticed that. It's like
holy. Half the time it comes up as holy. And I go, no, not that.
Perfect for the holidays. Perfect for the holidays. What I'm curious about is, what are you thinking about from your vantage point in terms of sort of what should researchers, initiative leaders, funders, all the different parts of sort of the ecosystem keep in mind when designing the work to ensure their efforts outlive their grants?
To me, that's such an interesting question because when most people write a grant, they're not thinking, oh, it's going to run out in 16 or 18 months. So let's build it so someone else can pick it up for me because I won't be able to pick it up myself. I mean, that's kind of a non-intuitive set of responses. But, in retrospect, I think there are some things looking at the two examples we gave, but some other ones too that I've come to see as part of the begetting. What can you do? And in the discussion draft that I shared, and I don't want to read through them because you all can take a look at the discussion draft, but on one of the pages, we identified 10 practical steps that could be potentially taken to create the conditions for work to be carried forward by others. And some of them are around anchoring the work in a widely shared problem or vision. Having a strong common vision is probably going to be very, very important. Building a durable network of folks, not just a small project team, but doing what you can to set up a network of experts who are likely to take it forward, even if you're not there or something happens and the workplace changes. creating a digital footprint is really important, and in the AI world, more important. I don't know that websites are going to prevail as much. I think they're going to are going to be less important, frankly. And a lot of the websites are now gated, and they're only open to members, and they have some of them have a subscription fee. That's kind of a problem if you want good information and you're going to kind of morph on top of something. Kind of hard to morph on top of a gated community. So I would just say that thinking ahead to, can you keep your stuff open? Can you commit to sharing? Can you commit to networking? What about if you go to conferences, and now the conferences, because of people's restricted travel budgets, I think they're over paneling. There's too many panels going up at the same time for the number of folks from your organization who can even go. So what are you going to do? Go home and look at a million slide decks? So in my mind, we should be thinking ahead to, what can you do to preserve some kind of a digital history or record that others could pick up. And there's, I think, a lot of thinking about what kind of information system or infrastructures would help us all in the future. So there would be some sort of an institutional memory. I'm using institution in the broadest sense, an ecosystem memory, because people like me who like to think about where things came from and give credit if I can, we're going to go away. And I don't know who's going to thank people and who's going to remember what happened. And I feel like it's important to have that kind of a memory. And the Wayback Machine is not going to do it. So I feel like we have to build intentionality through some infrastructures. Now, whether that's the Learner Wiki Ecosystem Library or other repositories that can be searchable, that can be shareable, that we can tap with AI bots, which I think we're going to use for that. I think we all need to be thinking as a community, as a research community, and as a leadership community around those kind of things. And then being able to communicate and map these kind of initiatives. And frankly, prepare for a handoff, even if you think there may not be a handoff. Thinking that somehow everything's going to rest with ourselves, probably not going to happen. So I think we ought to entertain the idea that we're going to have to participate in a collegial way in which maybe we haven't had to in the past. So those would be some of the things, and those are kind of covered in the discussion paper. And again, would really welcome thoughts on the folks that are here about what you think about those list of 10, because maybe there's other things that could be done.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I mean, I would underscore many of the same things that you raised. I feel like that build the ecosystem, not just the project, having interoperable, sort of portable, open data feels really important. A few things I would add, kind of putting on my evaluator hat, is show value early and often. I feel like is really important. So initiatives with sort of clear, demonstrable early wins really help to create sort of momentum, legitimacy, stakeholder buy-in, all these sorts of things. So having some of those early proof points along the way helps secure additional funding. It enables more folks to sort of come on board, more likelihood of sort of policy uptake, institutional sort of adoption. So I would add that. I would say always really important to engage with practitioners and policymakers to ensure sort of staying power in the work, right? So there's work, quite frankly, that we haven't funded this year because I didn't have a good handoff point, right? So I'm talking to my colleagues, like, who here on the student success team or the state policy team is going to take this and run with this? If not here, who in the field might be able or interested in doing that? So really ensuring that you're sort of co-creating with those individuals to ensure staying power, so that projects are built with, institutions, employers, workforce agencies, networks, and the like. And then finally, I would say this piece about sort of sustainability that you were talking about. It's really important at the outset, and I know, we've had even conversations about the non-degree credential research network, right? Like how, what will happen with the network? Will it exist in perpetuity? But like, how do these things continue over time when funding, goes away? And really thinking at the beginning, who will own this thing after the grant ends? What incentives do folks have to maintain it or evolve it? I'm involved in conversations right now about some work that we were talking about a sort of sunsetting, but the work is not actually sunsetting, right? It is about going to the next phase, and
Begetting,
it's
Wendy.
about begetting. That's what I'm trying to say, Holly. So kind of thinking about those questions right at the outset feels really important.
So you told me recently, and because I don't think you covered it quite yet, but you told me that Lumina had such sort of a policy or something about creating conditions for the work to be carried forward. And I was a little surprised, glad, and surprised to hear that. Can you say what that is again, just so I?
Yeah, so we were looking at our metrics over the last, year or two. And so we've done a few things with our metrics. One thing is that we moved from, just having outcomes, right, about student outcomes, result, in terms of enrollment, persistence, completion, and really focusing on outputs instead of outcomes, and trying to understand, what we're sort of seeding along the way. And one of the things that we had in there originally was all about uh, scaling the work. And what we realized is, it's really difficult to sort of figure out scale and what is like Lumina really scaling at the end of the day. But instead, we changed the metric. And of course, I don't have it in front of me, but it's more about spinning off exactly what we're talking about right now, begetting. It is about what was Lumina able to develop that somebody else then took and ran with. So we have that, I think when we talk about CBEN, when we talk about like the talent hubs work, right? These different pieces of sort of the ecosystem that was sort of seated here, achieving the dream, right? These things that started, and then like they went into the universe, and so now we have a metric around that that's really focused on, I guess really to your point, this piece
I
about
love that, the
begetting.
begetting metric.
That's right. Yes, higher learning advocates. Yes, another good one. Now all the people on this call can start to fill in all the blanks on that. So yeah, that's one of them.
So I know we have a few other questions or topics we hope we would get to, but Kyle, you need to give us a sign about whether or not you want to open things up or if you want us just to continue on with our,
Maybe
People are holding back in the chat for now, so I'm going to give people a few more minutes to come up with questions.
okay,
If you
cool.
guys want to continue.
Okay,
I'm also
cool.
going to throw some questions in the chat for folks,
Mhm.
just for folks on the call to sort of be thinking about. We would love to kind of hear from folks, what's sort of top of mind for you in this space, and kind of what you see as researchers, and kind of what you're experiencing on the ground. So I'm going to throw those in the chat as well, just to get folks thinking and poised for conversation. And Holly, maybe should we just talk really briefly about the elephant in the room, which is always AI.
Yeah,
Do you want to talk
yeah,
like just a little bit more kind of how we can preserve foundational work, in this era of sort of rapid change and AI generated content. Obviously, you're doing a lot of that with the library itself, but would love any additional thoughts you might have.
yeah. And that's the area we're trying to learn a lot in because we work with a tech group that I've learned a lot from for the library. And I put in content because they read in the mornings and our folks put more content in. And I keep saying, I don't know who's visiting, who's going to read this. This seems a little more left field or it seems too particular. And our tech person said to me, you are no longer writing content just for the visitors, the people visitors who come to the library. You're writing it for a text-based database for AI bots. And you want to have a good SEO ranking because you're trying to meet Mother Google. I call it Mother Google. He doesn't call it Mother Google. But there's a quality criteria for what accounts for ranking systems. So search engines will even pick up your information. So in a search, you'll come up higher. So I'm very aware now of what are the criteria for the search engines to pick up. I'm very aware that I want to build a credible with our team and all the collaborators that we're trying to work with, a credible library, a data system, a text-based data system that can help to feed information that we all need. So I think we have to build a learning infrastructure, and it will be very I don't want to say led by, but it will be very facilitated by AI. So that means we all have to be aware of bots, what they can do and not do, and what's the human space, the human voice in the design of AI in order to build the kind of information systems. Because hopefully we're not just making stuff up or calling a friend. It's nice to call a friend, but that's if you think of the A word before it, are you going to call 20 friends? Because you probably would get 20 different answers if you really did your research focus group, correctly. So I'm really concerned about the infrastructure side, and I keep thinking that we're going to all have to commit to either writing more or encouraging our colleagues to write more, get stuff into machine readable format so bots can pull it up so they can synthesize it so they can give it back because none of us have time to read everything. So we need it shorter when we need it quickly, whatever times we want to go on and talk to the bots about all this stuff. And I think it's the AI bots in the future going to hold our institutional memory, our ecosystem memory, that it won't reside in any one of us, hopefully. But at some point, it becomes in bot land where it begins to visit all the websites, visit all the documents that are written and whatever, so that we have places where we can pull in information. And so archives like the one that our library has built are going to, and that we're going to be expanding, is going to be an important place where we can host documents or websites that have gone away. Our tech guy went and pulled in Connecting Credentials website when we thought it was literally going away, like within a week, in like 30 seconds. Who knew? And whether or not there was ethics in that, they knew we were going to do it. We told them, but this is the world we're living in. We don't have to ask. Someone can go pull it in, and it looks like exactly the same website that was there, although it's not really there. It's a copy of it, but it works. So in my mind, we're all going to conferences. We have all these slide decks. None of us can read them all. Could a bot read them all and just tell us what is it? What are they all saying? What's in common? What new ideas are there? I feel like we're going to have to build the capacity to think among ourselves using AI well in order to inform us so that we can do good work. And that it's going to be a big role of researchers who I think normally think about these things. They do reviews of the literature. They're used to pulling in syntheses. They're used to having findings, and they know they're not going to be able to probably keep their grants going forever. So what are they going to do to hand it off so others can use hopefully the good information that they've collected? So in my mind, this is the kind of future that we're probably moving toward, and I don't know who's gonna develop all these. But in my mind, that's what I think is needed and what I like to think about in my off moments because I like to think about the future and what we can do. So I'm curious to know what everybody thinks about all this.
I think that is a perfect time to segue to opening it up for discussion. We did put a few questions in the chat. I think Holly's also raised, some bigger, broader questions in some of her remarks. So I think we can turn it to others to see if folks have remarks, comments, answers to any of the questions that have been posed or your own reflections.
I'm just going to start scrolling now, seeing who's here. I haven't been able to scroll to see who's in the room.
I can pop on and break open the silence and say that this seems like really useful stuff. So thank you all for sharing about it. I wasn't aware of the library. Um, and of course, I'm biased and do research. Not that I think research papers are the most useful things to have in a library, but I would definitely hope that that's where your bot was going next, is like Google Scholar and Eric and stuff to pull in some research. And I'm more of the gray literature. I think a lot of the stuff you're planning to pull in, but kind of like guidance documents, because I do think that there's a big audience of people looking for like what has the Department of Labor put out, about credentials and things like that. So I think like pulling in whatever is coming out federally in terms
Susie,
of
can you say where
guidance
you're
around.
from? That would help us tell
Sorry, Rand
oh, Rand, okay,
Corporation.
good.
And I do research on credentials and stuff like that. And yeah, so we do like it just would be useful to have like research papers in here. It'd be useful to have gray literature. It'd be useful to have federal guidance. Whatever your bot could pull into this, I think it would be useful. And I think like I found Sarah Goldrick Robb, for instance, started up a basic needs library that I find very useful. But I think it is a tough question of who maintains it and stuff like that. So I hope you guys do find a way to sustain and maintain it and pull in even more content in
And great
addition
to
to
hear
what's
that.
in there.
And our bot, it searches our library, which is not fully complete, obviously. We're just still building it. But we also have a license to ChatGTP, and we may be actually switching to some other of the bots and stuff. So we're searching beyond that. Now, whether or not the bots or ChatGTP or others are searching all the more academic sites, I don't know that. But that would be good for us to know that. And we may at some point want to have a group of researchers, maybe like yourself, who could advise us about how could we improve the research, uh, capability side of our library. Because right now it speaks a lot to employers, policymakers, institutions that are trying to build micro-credentialing programs, collect the actual statute language for states that want to copy, say what SUNY did on micro-credentialing. 5 other states could just send us the language, make it easy for us to go get all that stuff, because they don't know where to go get it always. So like there's lots of information needs that everybody has. So it's good to
Agreed.
meet
That's
you.
I may just be the wrong audience too for it,
Oh
but
no,
like
I think you're
that.
exactly
And
the
so, but
right
that's
audience.
useful too. I think like yeah, having stuff for the. I do think states want to learn from each other. I wonder, you guys have more direct connections with states who are kind of working in the weeds on these things than I am, but like I wonder how much they're able to search through and like translate these things, like and find the right thing that they're looking for, or like how if they would need some scaffolding to like understand like these are the
Yes.
subsets of programs that are like what I'm looking for,
Sure, and
stackable, how
and
to
the
build
the
stackable programs
and
or
the
whatever.
intermediaries, a lot of the think tank intermediaries that work in this space, a lot of the library is for them. Like if they're under a contract to a state or 3 states, or whatever, and they need to provide some short briefing papers, because the policymakers are not going to want a 50-page report, but they want something short. So the intermediaries could go and collect it. The intermediaries may or may not be able to keep up. So this is where we all have to kind of have the networks in order to help each other out, would be my take. So that's one of the thoughts.
I just wanted to briefly chime in also to add just an idea, plant the seed, so to speak, for those who are here. Kyle and I have been talking about the role of the NCRN on some level in terms of as a network of trying to bring people together. And to your question, Lindsay, about like the research community, I think we do see ourselves as hoping to be a resource in that way as well. And so you may all see an email from us at some point in the next month or so, maybe asking if you want for researchers, if you'd like to be part of like a research repository where we'll just collect information on like what you're working on, what are some of the papers you've written, some of the topics you work on, so that we can begin to sort of be that resource for the research community and help make connections when people are looking for research in particular areas or trying to get connected to each other, and certainly will also help us in our planning in terms of bringing the research to the fore in our field. So just an idea and something if you have thoughts on, we certainly would be open to thinking about how we could structure that and how we could use that, and hopefully you'll be part of it among as well as others who are on this meeting
I
today as
would
well.
just I would just riff off her. That's a very cool idea, I think. But one thing you do is if you at some point were able to put a certain amount of information together, you could actually have a room at the inn at the library and put a partnership like we're doing with ACRO or some of these other groups, and then the intel that you collect could be going out broadly to lots of folks. So I would just say that that's an intent for us to find ways to get information out to much broader groups of folks.
Sounds good.
I do have a question I thought I would ask to both Holly and Wendy, which is when you think about the projects that you've been involved in over the years, we talked about connecting credentials as one where there have been looking back after over 10 years, there has been an impact. There have been kind of strands of that work that have been picked up in other places. But are there any projects that you've been involved in where you feel like the research community that we should be paying attention to, that we should look back to in particular, and see if there's more that we can learn from? are there any particular projects that maybe you feel, people have forgotten about unfairly or unjustly that we should be looking to incorporate more into our current work?
Wendy, why don't you go first?
Oh my gosh. I mean, what I'm sitting here thinking, Kyle, is like literally everything. I'm like, I constantly
I
am
was
like,
afraid you might say that. Yeah.
like that. It's not necessarily a huge body. I mean, it is
Yeah.
also like big initiatives that Lumina has led, absolutely. And a bunch of like smaller grants that weren't a part of big bodies of work. I mean, this is too small and it won't really mean anything, although sometimes they join. But there was work, Holly, that you actually seeded, I believe, with Education Design Lab. And it was all this work with employers. And again, in this world that we're living around, right now with credentials of value and work that they did there. And I constantly go back and point people to that work. Like, here's some things that were learned about, like, what employers care about and, in terms of skills and competencies and the like, and micro credentials and so on and so forth. So honestly, the list is probably too long to name. If I'm being really real, I feel like from almost all the work that we've seeded and done, both big projects as well as smaller grants, there's tons of stuff that folks could go back to because there is a fair amount of duplication. So I think what's really important is for the research community to be really mindful of like, okay, this is what we've actually learned around these big research questions, and then making sure that, we're moving to the next stage of things. But I don't know, Holly, if there's things that you want to.
If I was going to go look at like a portfolios, not only at Lumina, but someone gave me here's our portfolios for like 5 of the big foundations, whatever. It'd be really interesting to go back and then say, this is what happened then, but now think about this in an AI world, because we didn't know about AI, and now the rules of the game are changing. So I would want to take some of those research findings or those trends or insights, and then wrap them in an AI sensitivity to see what more could be done about that. There's another area with skills first hiring taking off in Sherman and so many employers. Not that that's going to happen tomorrow, but it's happening quickly, and applicant tracking systems are reviewing candidates, maybe not fairly, it looks like, with all the lawsuits starting to happen or whatever, and ghosting going on by employees. But that's a big area, skills first hiring, and then what credentials stand for skills, truly, what are people going to recognize as of value? And so in my mind, industry certifications are really, really important. And a lot of the foundations didn't fund that much. Lumina did a little early funding around industry certifications and then kind of moved on to some other more mainline areas, to be honest. That's my assessment. And I feel like we should be looking more at industry certifications. They still sit outside, even though people are trying to bring them in. I know Higher Learning Commission trying to bring them in more to have more of a quality aspect of that and share more. So I feel like there's certain pieces of the ecosystem that are going to become more important that I wish we could pay more attention to. So those would be some things that I'm also, in addition to having an better infrastructure, I'd like us personally to think about things like that, but particularly, does any of our perception change if we put on an AI hat? And I think increasingly we all have to be asking that.
I think some more collaborative thinking and work on industry certifications would be great right now, especially with Workforce Pell regs coming out in a week's discussion. So I would love to see that. And I also have thought about the mapping and the begetting, and it really helps me to think about how folks are collaboratively funding and how that continues to progress, and then how it might help us look at where funding gaps are, particularly for groups of learners. So in Minnesota, we're working on a project for recredentialing internationally trained professionals. So one of the things I'm thinking about from what you've talked about today is the initial work that we're doing, how that begets more work, but then also how does that help us see the gaps both for the recredentialing piece for internationally trained professionals, but also other kinds of resources that they need for life. Where are those gaps? How do we, and we've had discussions in different settings about braiding and how people are constantly sitting and looking for different ways to bring the funding together, and to have AI and funders help us map that out, I think would be really great. And the other thing I think about with all this work is capacity. So we want to use AI to help us, but we're learning that to build what we need to through AI takes a lot of capacity to begin with, which we don't have.
So agree with you. We talk about humans, whatever, but when I read what some of us are getting back from AI, I think, okay, I'm going to bring my nuanced thinking as much as I can. But we brought in a couple graduate interns from library and information sciences, 4 graduate interns, all super, super smart. And we're working with them on content stuff. But they don't know the nuances, and it's going to take a while for them. They know what a lot of us have lived through, but so it's not like you can turn it over just to smart graduate students. You can't. And I was hoping we could, frankly. And then, well, this will be
Yeah.
easy. We'll just automate AI and have grad. No, so that's another hard lesson learned is you kind of have to develop the nuanced thinking in a very sophisticated, difficult climate that's international, not just the US. Was it going to take to have that kind of capacity?
Mm.
Well, we are basically at time. We have 1 minute remaining. So if either of our panelists want to offer any concluding thoughts, they're welcome to do so.
When do you go?
No, I just thinking back on your question, Kyle, and just
Yeah,
reflecting. I think I might try to share out something after the conversation. All of our work on productivity, which Holly, I know you were part of,
yeah.
that's another really big one where we had, I think we have a brief put together looking back on some of the impact and lessons learned from that. And I think that could be really valuable for this group. So I'm gonna find that document and share it with everyone as well.
Yeah, we'd be happy to distribute anything to either everyone who's registered after today. We'd be happy to send that out, and we'll probably be posting a recording of this of this webinar as well.
I would
So
just like to say, we'd like to hear from you one-to-one or send us notes. We're trying to build sort of a wiki model. The field has got to collaborate on having a better information infrastructure. So just would love to hear from you all. And if you want to do it through the NCRN or directly to our library, any way we get information would be great.
all right, sounds good. So this was the end of our webinar series for this year, but we will return in January. We do have a webinar that we're planning out, looking at the quality of different data sources around the labor market, especially job postings data that we will hopefully be announcing very soon. That'll be probably late January. We'll also be sending out some emails shortly with some reminders about our spring conference, which we are beginning to plan more earnestly for in the coming weeks. If people wish to be involved in planning for the NCRN Spring Conference, or wish have any ideas for topics or presentations, or wish to kind of have let us know about research you'd like to present, please feel free to reach out to either me or Michelle. We'd always love to talk to our members about ways to involve everyone in our conference planning. So again, thank you so much, Holly, Wendy. We really enjoyed this, and I'll look forward to seeing you all again in our programming. Thank you all.
Thanks. Happy holidays.
Yes, and happy holidays. That's right. Thanks, Holly. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.